Hey, it's me, TB, and today I'm going to be doing a video where I talk about the books that I want to reread. A lot of these are just books I've read fairly recently, but I want to read them again so I can annotate them, because I don't like annotating books on my first read through, because I want to be able to notice like foreshadowing to where events end up going, you know? And just in general, I think that certain lines will hit harder once you kind of like know how things end up being resolved. And obviously I can talk about all the books that I want to reread. So I have all of my social media linked down below, and there you can see me talk about all kinds of books. That includes my GoodReads, where you can just see all the books that I have read forever, basically, or at least since like 2014 or so. So without further ado, if you end up liking this video or me, you can subscribe, like, share, all that shit. So let's get started. So first up is Untamed by Sylvia Moreno-garcia. I read this, I think, in February of 2020. So this book is following Viridiana as she lives in this small town in Baja California in 1979. And it is a small town that basically makes its living off of like tourism and sharks. Like they like kill sharks basically. And she's bored, and she's very like lofty goals of what life would be like if it was a movie basically. And one day this group of tourists come to town, but I think it is like not tourist season. And so she ends up getting like roped into helping them because they need a translator, and she can speak both like Spanish and English. And she ends up getting like kind of drawn closely into their circle, and eventually one of them ends up being killed, and Viridiana ends up having to lie to end up protecting her other two friends. Shit gets out of control from there. I think I heard this talked about as a coming of age turned noir, like a noir coming of age. And a noir is basically our main character is being corrupted or like becomes morally gray. And I should probably say this as well, that pretty much every book I'm going to talk about was like a 5 stars from me, besides like 1 or 2 maybe. This one was, I think, 5 stars. So one of the blurbs on the back says, superb, part classic whodunit, part sad love story, and part smart pulpy noir, packed with smiling snakes, a touch of mythology, and a strong female lead. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, there you go. Next is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is a like modern classic really, because Sylvia Plath was or is known more for her poems and her poetry than her like novel, but she wrote at least 1 novel, I'm pretty sure. And this is following Esther, as she is basically kind of like dealing with depression. And when this was written, I think in like the 60s or like the 50s, we didn't have a lot of people talking about like mental illness the way this book does. It doesn't talk about it in like a positive way, I guess, but more so of like how destructive it can be, because Esther's life pretty much gets ruined because of it. So it does get very like dark. I don't remember if it becomes happy towards the end or not, but yeah, basically if like you have depression and you haven't read this, you probably should, because like there's some like quotes from this that hit very hard. Though it is a classic, the parts about that where she talks about like how depression affects her, it hits very close to home. I haven't read this since probably like my 2nd year of college, so it's been a few years. So I would like to read it again, mostly so I can like feel that pain all over again and probably cry. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and get like the one book that I think isn't a 5 stars out of the way, because The Bell Jar was also 5 stars. And the one book on this list that isn't 5 stars is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I read this in like December 2019, I think, and I gave it like 3 stars. And I think that was being generous, because you see, I don't see what everyone else liked with this, because I did not like my time with it. I thought it was like boring, and it just went on for too long, and just like I was expecting more like demonic portrait shit. Like the portrait being corrupted only comes into play like towards the very end, so I was not satisfied with that really, because you spend like so much time just doing nothing really, and the portrait takes forever to like start doing its magical bullshit. This is a classic that follows this guy called Dorian, and he gets this portrait painted, and eventually through like 100 pages later, he basically makes like a pact with the devil, pretty much, that makes it so he won't age, but this painting will change shape depending on like how badly he lives his life. And obviously it becomes corrupt very quickly because he is an awful person. So yeah. And basically, like, I want to like this because like Oscar Wilde was one of like the few like openly queer writers we have from like, you know, decades and like a century ago, you know. I want to like his writing, but I just did not like this. So hopefully a second read will change my mind, hopefully. So I was looking and I found out that I only have like one other like modern book really, and that is The Body in the Garden by Catherine Shellman. And this is a historical mystery, and in this one, Lily Adler is a widow and she is kind of coming back to London after like being away, because I think she like moved out to like be with her husband, but he has died, so she's like moving back into town as a widow, of course. And she is like soon roped back into like her familiar circles. She's asked to go to this party, and while she's there, she like goes outside to like get some fresh air, I guess, and she goes to like the like hedge maze, I think. And while she's out there, she hears some people arguing and a gunshot, and then she kind of like investigates, and it turns out that a man is dead. So she basically decides to like figure out who killed this man and why. And yeah, I read this, I think I read this in 2019. I don't remember because I got an arc of it. I do remember really liking it. I read it in a long time, and I think its like sequel is coming out in 2021, I think. So yeah, I want to have this like fresh in my mind when I read the sequel, because we don't have like romance happening in this book because she is like freshly widowed, but I think we're getting like hints of a romance with like a like Navy captain. So I love that. And yeah, basically I really like this and I want to like read it again because I don't remember the twist anymore, and I remember being really surprised by the twist. So maybe I can like find it out now with like some like fragments of my memory. Probably not, but let's hope. Next up is the only piece of like nonfiction I have on this list, I think. Well, there's one where it's like debatable on whether or not it is like an autobiography or not, but we'll get there when we get there. So next is Goodbye in Torah by Carnegie Pantion. I know I did not pronounce that right. Basically, this is about the Armenian genocide that happened during World War I, where basically the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, and you know there was this like power struggle basically, and basically Armenians were basically rounded up and like slaughtered. I remember from like reading this that essentially all of like young men were basically rounded up and conscripted into the military, and then when they like got to where they were supposed to like, or like where they were asked to go, they were all killed. What's left of his family ends up being sent to like walk to this other city like far away from like Turkey, and when they're there, they're basically like not given any like food, so they're basically like, sitting out in the desert starving to death. Basically it's like very heavy, but I remember like not liking reading it, but it's very like well written, and I think that is important to like learn and talk about, because before this I didn't even know there was a genocide of Armenian people, so that's kind of shitty. And this basically follows the author from like the start of the war to like the end, when he's found at one of these like schools where a lot of Armenian children were sent to, where they're like sent there to basically like not be Armenian anymore, where they basically were told to like give up their culture and they were given new names. If that sounds familiar, there's a reason for that. And yeah, it's just a heavy read that I want to like go back through again, because I haven't read it in like a few years, and I want to be able to like talk about it again, you know. Next up are my classics by Black authors. I think I have 3 of these. So first up is Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid. I talk about this book all the fucking time, but this is about our main character Annie as she is growing up on the Caribbean island of Antigua. And like a lot of Kincaid's works, this focuses a lot on the bond between the mother and the daughter, and just how complicated that bond can be, you know. And I want to go back through and like mark this up because this book made me cry, and there were a lot of scenes that kind of like stuck with me. Even though this is like very short, I think that it's very like powerful, because Kincaid does a very good job of like capturing what a relationship with a mother can be like, you know. So obviously I don't like hate my mom, but like how complicated it feels when like you're like a teenager and you have like these weird feelings towards your mother because you don't hate her, but you don't like love her either. So it's really complicated, you know. Yeah, that's what Kincaid writes about a lot. It's one of those books where like the premise has to like pull you in or not. So if you want to read about a coming of age that takes place in the Caribbean that deals with like the bonds between family members, here you go. Next is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I read this in high school and I haven't read it since, and that was like almost half a decade ago, so yeah, it's been a while. And from what I remember, this is following our main character, Celie, is basically like sent off to be married by this man who's very abusive, and she's separated from her sister, and eventually finds out that her sister writing to her, but the letters were being like stashed away, and yeah, it's like a whole fucking thing. And I do remember that this book does get sapphic. Don't know how to call it. Like, I think you would call this a sapphic novel. I personally would, because like the relationship is a like pretty big part of this. So there you go. And obviously like trigger warning for like abuse, because I'm pretty sure the abuse does get pretty violent during certain points. And yeah, I remember really liking this, and I want to read it again and hopefully get a better like edition, because this one is like very old and like kind of falling apart now. So I want a like new one, but don't want to get a new one without reading it one more time, so I can like be sure that I like it, you know. And then finally is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, and this is following Janie Crawford as she is kind of like living her life through these 3 marriages, and how she kind of like finds her own happiness, even though she is like living in the like 1920s and 1930s. So yeah, there isn't much else to say really, because like one of the things where like if you like reading classics, you want to read this or not. I will say that the prose in this is like fucking incredible. There are like multiple parts in this where I wanted to like highlight passages, but of course I only do that on like my second reads, so I can do that whenever I go back to reread this. Something interesting about this is that Alice Walker, I'm pretty sure it was her, went through and like I think she was like either doing her master's or like her PhD, and through like researching like and through research found Zora Neale Hurston and like discovered that she had like published multiple novels. It's basically thanks to Alice Walker that we kind of like know about Zora Neale Hurston and have like this book as a classic, because I don't think it was even talked about really until like the 70s whenever Walker found it again. So next up I have 2 gay classics. First of those is Such Times by Christopher Coe. I think I read this earlier this year, and I remember really liking it. It is very like heavy and hard to read because it deals with the AIDS epidemic, and this is the book that I said is probably a little bit more autobiographical than fiction, because a lot of these events are like written in such a way that it feels like too real almost, you know. And I remember one of the GoodReads reviews that talked about this kind of said that few events like kind of parallel the author's life. So this is basically following a relationship throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I'm pretty sure, as the AIDS epidemic is kind of going through America and killing a lot of like gay men. And so obviously their relationship at the like center of this has to kind of like deal with AIDS and how it kind of changes both them and their circle of friends and society around them. So yeah, it is like very heavy, and I did really like it, but again, it's just like a heavy, dark read. And yeah, I still remember how like chapter 1 ends, because it ends with a very like big plot reveal that makes the whole book even like sadder than what it like sounds like. So the blurbs on the back kind of call this the gay novel of the decade, perhaps the greatest novel of the AIDS epidemic, and gives voice to the dreams and terrors of an entire generation. So obviously this was like very well received, and the author himself died of AIDS I think like a year after this was released. And then finally for this video is Jane from the Dance by Andrew Holleran. Pretty sure I read this in like 2019 now, but who knows? This year has been fucking weird. This is following, like, this novel is framed in an interesting way, because the meat of this novel is framed as though it is a manuscript being like sent between friends, because one of them is trying to basically publish this as a like look into this one guy's life. And yeah, and like the framing of this is kind of like Frankenstein if you read it. Like there are like letters being sent back and forth. The majority of this novel takes place in New York during the 1970s, when Malone comes to New York for the first time, and he basically gets sucked into the gay scene of New York during the time, and all the like good and bad that entails, and just kind of captures what it was like to be gay in New York during the 1970s. And the author himself kind of like lived in New York during that time period, so it is like an accurate representation of what it was like to live there during that time. This one is also like heavy to read because it doesn't like sugarcoat what it was like, but it doesn't also make it like too dark, you know. It really does feel like a real look into it, because there was like really good parts and like sad part. And this book was first published in 1978, so it is getting up there when it comes to classics, you know. And so the blurbs about this call it the classic coming of age gay novel, an astonishingly beautiful book, the best gay novel written by anyone of our generation. So obviously this was like very well received as well. And yeah, those are the books that I want to reread. If you like this video, subscribe, like, share, all that shit. And hopefully I will see you next week.